Good morning, everybody. My name's Vikki Heywood. I'm the chairman of the RSA, and it's a very great pleasure to welcome you all here for today's special event. Before we begin, could I, of course, ask you to check that your mobile phones are switched to silent? Of course, we're very happy for you to tweet, but if your phones could be switched to silent, we'd be very grateful. And that's also to remind you that this event is being recorded and is, of course, going out live. And it will be available to download after this event from the RSA website or indeed from the Arts Council website. If you are wishing to Twitter, or for those of you who are viewing us from home, the hashtag is RSAACE. That's hashtag RSAACE if you wish to use Twitter. And as that suggests, today's event is a partnership between the RSA and the Arts Council, and I'm very pleased indeed, as chairman, with a strong connection to the arts, that this was one of the early ideas that came along after I'd taken up the chairmanship of the RSA. So this is the culmination of a series of seminars towards Plan A, a new political economy for arts and culture. And those seminars have resulted in the pamphlet which is being launched today, which offers a fresh contribution to what we hope is an increasingly robust and clear and energising case for investment in the arts and culture in the UK today. In his paper for the report, Martin Smith, who joins us in the room today, argues that there can be no more appropriate place than the RSA to host discussion and publish papers about the dynamics of the creative economy. And I would also say that I'm very keen, as chairman of the RSA, that we also look to the other parts of our title, to manufacturing and commerce, and to make sure that we really are a place where all of those debates can come together. As part of the RSA's renewed mission to enrich society through ideas and action, we're looking at how we can align our activities under an emerging new concept, the power to create, to liberate and support as many people as possible to act on their own initiative, to establish better lives for themselves and a better world for others. Our aspiration is that arts and culture shall become central to the RSA's pursuit of that goal, as we find the world facing enormous economic and environmental challenges, and a set of institutions and governments struggling to meet these challenges. We believe the arts has a unique role to play in the task of rehumanising society and in giving us all the power to create a better world. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome today's speakers, who all have unique insights as to how we might go about that task. The structure of this morning's session is that Sir Peter Bazalgette and Alan Davey, Chairman of the Arts Council and Chief Executive of the Arts Council, will give a short presentation on the holistic case for arts and culture. In response, the leading consultant and report author, John Knell, will come to the podium and give his views on the recommendations and challenges emerging from the report. And then we will gather a group of panellists together so we can talk more broadly and also engage you in a discussion and debate as it takes us across arts organisations, local governments and institutions. The panellists are Nicola Thorold, Executive Producer at the Roundhouse, Deborah Bull, Director of Cultural Partnerships at King's College London, and Assistant Mayor with responsibility for culture, sport and capital projects at Bristol City Council, Simon Cook. We've got a lot to get through, so let's kick off with Alan Davey and Sir Peter Bazalgette coming to the podium to give you their thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vikki, and thanks very much to Vikki and Matthew and everyone at the RSA for hosting these series of events in the last 6 or 7 months, which have been tremendously valuable, I think, for all of us as we develop these thoughts. It was about 6 or 7 months ago that I stood here and gave a speech which is sort of referred to on the slide there, a grand partnership. In my early days as chairing the Arts Council, I've been going around the country. I've been visiting many cities and other communities where the local authority and the Arts Council and local business and higher education institutions were working really hard to put together valuable partnerships to deliver arts and culture to the benefit of everyone. But there was something missing for me, and as it went on, and as my visits went on, and as our thinking went on, I reflected that we started to make a public investment in arts and culture seriously in the Second World War under SEMA. Then it was crystallised in 1946 when the Arts Council was funded under Maynard Keynes. And since 1946, I'd argue that politically there's been unanimity that we should make a public investment in arts and culture. Some parties may have put it up or down from time to time, but broadly nobody has ever disagreed with that proposition. But we've been doing it for so long, and the unanimity has gone on for so long, we've forgotten why we're doing it. And it seemed to me that we couldn't articulate clearly the whole picture of why we make a public investment in the arts, the whole picture of what the public benefits are. And as a result, we couldn't develop the policies for the 21st century that we need, social, political policies, that are going to drive that benefit further. Alan.
Okay. So as Baz said, we feel we've got really the next 18 months to make all the elements of the case for funding the arts. We say the next 18 months because after the next election, when the new government comes in, there will be very quickly some spending discussions. And the last spending discussions we had with the Treasury were based on the arts, culture and the economy. And the Treasury were very polite about it. They said, you are making strong arguments. You're making arguments that are strong enough to get you to the table. Therefore, we are taking you seriously. But actually, what about the rest? They actually said, what about the rest? Because we know that we don't just fund the arts for its contribution to the economy. We fund it for a whole host of reasons. So Baz and I wanted to capture what that whole picture is, to articulate it in an easy way, but then get on with the hard bit of filling in the evidence and the arguments and the articulation to form that whole argument that we can use with politicians, that we can use to engage the public, and that we can use to really, well, stand up for ourselves and explain with confidence what we do. It's something that's been kind of obsessing me throughout my career. I mean, at the DCMS, I was arguing for the intrinsic value for culture, the economic value, the social value, everything. So I've done it all at some point. But various fads have kind of taken place in research and research interests, and I think we need to bring everything together now, and that's what we're on about now. Okay, so I need to ask for our slides now, please. Thank you. And you're off. You're off. We're off. So at the heart of our argument has to be culture. Culture and what it does in itself. Because if we don't get the culture right, if you like, if we don't create the conditions for great culture, for great art to happen, then all the other things that we talk about don't happen. And we need to get better at articulating that. And various of us over the years have tried this. And in addition, we need to kind of unpick that cultural argument as well. It's not just the intrinsic value of culture. Culture is a good thing for you. It's trying to unpick that a bit. It's about trying to get the notion of an empathetic citizen. It's about getting the notion of how you challenge ideas and explore ideas using culture. And it's about... Sorry, I forgot my blob. It's about how we explore ideas, challenge existing ideas, and use culture to change the world, frankly. We all know it can. But we need to capture those arguments. It's all very well me kind of saying it and talk about it now, but I want us to have some discussion and really get to the essence of what those arguments are in the next 18 months. So now, just to reassure you, we are power mad, and there will be a master plan at the end of the presentation with all these, as Alan so eloquently put it, blobs on our plan for world domination. So we will give you our plan for world domination at the end, but we're just going to build up to it gradually because we don't want too many shocks this early in the morning. So, the second of our headings, and just to remind you, Alan said culture. We start with culture. Culture is at the core of this, the intrinsic value of culture, the benefits that culture brings us comes first. We should always talk about it first, in our opinion. Education. So, the way in which our arts and culture feeds into our liberal education, our liberal arts education at every level, at primary and secondary, and of course the Arts Council is involved now with
for instance, the Department of Education and Music Hubs, which is directly funded, the way in which higher education is now taking responsibility and seeking to be a partner in every local community. They want higher education institutions, as they now define their role. They want their students to have a brilliant time, so they want great arts institutions in the area. They want to be involved in the local economy. They want it to be a place people want to come and study, people want to come and work. They want institutions there that their graduates can take their first step into professional careers. So higher education is now beginning to define itself as the core of every community and its arts and culture. And of course, there's continuing and lifelong learning, which is incredibly strong, both, you might say, as a soft skill and a hard skill, depending on whether it's an evening study course or whether it's just simply an attendance at the theatre. Both of those things are part of lifelong learning. Alan.
The arguments around culture and society. I mean, a few years ago, these were arguments that were at the core of our thinking, and they were at the heart of any political discussion that we had. And I think perhaps in some circles and in some aspects of it, making those arguments has become less fashionable, actually, in some regards, but it's always been there. And we know that what culture does for society, I mean, it can embrace simple well-being. The need to entertain and engage. There's a whole societal issue about equality of access to culture and what other forces in society mean in terms of people's ability to get the benefits that culture can bring. There are all kinds of arguments around health, all kinds of arguments about how culture can connect with people for whom society seems to be offering very little, and perhaps overcome that poverty of aspiration and be the missing link for things to come together for individuals. I'll always, the example I always use is the place that I come from, Teesside, where we've had so much money put in over the years for infrastructure. We've got some of the best roads in the world, and yet, levels of engagement in both sport and culture and higher education, there's a problem there. People moving away, graduates going to the great education institutions there but not staying. And there was a move a few years ago to build a narrative for better engagement with individuals there using culture, and I think we need to, and many of the local authorities are heavily involved with that. So we need to capture this again, I think. A few years ago, our ex-council member, Francois Matarazzo, wrote a pretty seminal report on society and culture. And we need to revisit those arguments again, but not be ashamed of using them. And it was very interesting. I mean, my most recent talks with the Treasury, they were engaged with this. They were open to this. So, there isn't a kind of bit of this whole picture that we're trying to build that isn't important, and this certainly isn't one of them. Yes.
Economy. So, if you start by talking about arts and culture, by talking about the value to the economy, you are deservedly labelled as somebody who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And we say very strongly it's about the intrinsic value of culture first. But you cannot ignore the benefits of arts and the economy. And every city and every town I go to, they know that whether it's the regional regeneration or the tourist offer, it has a critical role to play in economic benefit and delivery. But, as you know, because we've been discussing this now for several months, there are other elements to it. There is the way in which talent feeds into the creative industries and creates genuine economic value in the future. And we quote often the fact that the people who ran the wonderful Olympic ceremony, Stephen Daldry and Danny Boyle, who've created some of the most cash-generative movies in this country in the last decade, started in regional theatre. But also, and this is in a sense a relatively new aspect to the agenda, it's cultural exports. You've seen the British Council research that tells you that people who've come into contact with British culture are more likely to trade with Britain. We know that our international standing in culture and art is second to none, actually, particularly since the Olympics, but not just because of the Olympics. People are astonished at the cultural offer in this country and very impressed by it, when it is, whether by a touring company or whether by, for instance, an NT Live going to 350 cinemas around the world with its wonderful productions. So, the economic value of the investment in arts and culture, regional regeneration, tourism, cultural exports, creative industries and employment is part of it. Now, fanfare of trumpets. Da-da-da. There you are, world domination. Joking apart, there you see culture at the centre. Culture comes first. And there you see all the elements we've spoken about. Now, you could cut this a number of different ways, and as you see, there's one extra blob which says, what do you think? This goes live on the Arts Council website today and reveals, when you click on some of the blobs, I think, Alan, I'm right in saying it'll reveal some of the evidence and examples.
I hope so. I'm looking at my team.
Yes. There's a slightly dubious nod from somebody.
That's definite for Alan.
Fine. And because, you know, of course you could cut this another way, and each of you will have your take on this, and each of you will say you've missed this section. But this is one approach to it. Whichever approach we take, we need to give the whole picture. And that's, as you see there, just to go through it, culture at the centre, the empathetic citizen, identity and collective memory, inspiring ideas and fresh insights, quality of life. Society, health, the way it feeds into health, social care, disadvantage, prisons, engagement, equality of access, well-being and entertainment. Education at the top, primary, secondary, higher, continuing and lifelong. And their economy, as I was saying, creative industries and employment, cultural exports, regional regeneration and tourism. Do you want to add something about how we're going to go from there?
Well, I mean, the other thing I want to add is, of course, they all connect. And you can see connections between engagement, equality of access and education, etc. And indeed higher education and the economy. I mean, there are connections you can make all around, which is why we want to consider it as a whole thing. In terms of the next few months, we want your response to this. And indeed, do you want to put the last slide up?
I will do everything you want me to.
Yeah. So we want your response to this. We want your response. Are these concepts worth thinking about? What policy should flow from it? What are the most important? Are we using the right words even? We've had a huge debate already within the Arts Council, and what you saw up there is probably, you know, our current work in progress in terms of the words. So when you look at the pamphlet, hopefully there's a link on Baz and I's introduction, which will take you through to this. And we're after your responses. We'll be working on this in the next few months, and by spring we want to kind of talk about it again and reiterate it. But looking at the blobs, we know there's a lot of research going on each of those blobs. Am I allowed to use the word blob? I suppose it's the time about now.
You already have,
yeah, I have. The blobs all have a lot of work behind them that exists, and one of the things that we're going to be doing is bringing it all together, but also identifying where we need new arguments, where we need more research, and where we need to kind of just nail a few things down. So that by next year, we are ready for whatever the new government brings. Whatever the new government brings, it will be challenges. But we need the place for culture to be readily recognised and readily asserted as we talk to whoever that new government is, and also as we develop strategies locally for the next few years, which we know, looking at the graphs, are going to be very difficult. Thank you.
Could I just add one more word? And it is that I was at a meeting the other day of what's called the Core Cities Group, which, as you know, is some major cities outside London. And we were discussing this, and we had a good discussion about it, but one of the points that was made, slightly witheringly to me, I thought, as I was a naive Johnny-come-lately, which I am, it's true, was, well, we know all this, we know about all that. The question is not whether we in this room know about this, the question is who else knows about it, and the question is who else understands it. My experience of the first 9 months being chair of the Arts Council is in government, amongst politicians and civil servants, arts and culture is very low down the agenda. These things are not understood. If they're not understood, we can't develop policies from it that will maximise the benefit of arts and culture in the future. And I think that's the task of the next 18 months, to get the message beyond here, refine it, and always to talk about the whole picture. So, finally, it's good night from him, and it's good night from me. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's quite strange having the lectern on this side because you sort of have to rotate quite a lot to address everyone. I don't know how many of you saw the newspaper. I'm under-blobbed, by the way. I have no slides. I feel a bit under-blobbed. I don't know how many of you saw the newspaper headlines this morning that Ofsted thinks that school life for our children should start at 2 years old. Apart from my heart sinking, it did leave me wondering what would the main preschool nursery provision look like if arts and cultural sector was running it in terms of creative play and thinking. And just as Ken Robinson rather brilliantly reminded us with his fantastic turns of his ability to do a well-turned phrase, education is an art form, not a delivery system. When did it turn into a branch of FedEx, which is something that he said next week. Look, just to be topical to begin with. Look, first of all, I've got a few words of thanks and then a quick word about process. The thanks are to our paper writers, who at short notice produced incredibly high-quality pieces of work, and they also committed to come to a seminar discussion which a group like you and as bright as you picked the work apart and then had to revise it and produce them. So thanks to Martin Smith, thanks to Sue Horner, thanks to Alexandra Jones, and also to Mandy Barnett and Daniel Fujiwara. Thanks also to our excellent panellists. For those of you that managed to come to some of the sessions, we had a brilliant set of panellists who added much to the debate. And also to our, we could never work out the right name for this, our reflection group. In the spirit of Peter's grand partnership that he laid out in his inaugural lecture, we invited to every seminar session representatives from that grand partnership. So chief executives of local authorities, LEP heads, sorry, that sounds quite strange, doesn't it? Local economic partnership heads and other independent experts. Because, of course, part of the merit of this whole exercise, whatever happens from today, is that was to put those people in a different conversation with each other, to pick up on what Peter just said, to make sure that all of us, if we're the arts and culture sector here this morning collectively, we're having those broader conversations with experts outside to make our case. Thanks also to the RSA, Joe Hallgarten, Matthew Taylor, Selina, Mari, all the RSA team who have superbly shaped and supported this whole work, and I owe them a big debt of thanks. My role was to act as commissioner and rapporteur to this process. So the summary, there's a summary chapter in the report that you'll see today which summarises the key themes that emerged from the seminar series. I just want to remind everyone that it had a very clear aim, which was to remake the public and private investment case for the arts. And a couple of other things to stress about that. Part of our ambition was not to do that in a protecting what we already have or defence against the cuts way, but about making a renewed investment pitch that will over time increase the stock of investment going into the arts. Our start point, therefore, was how to scale our ambitions and impact, not protecting what we have. How can we project greater benefit and impact, to be highly strategic as well as brilliantly tactical. And with that aim in mind, the summary chapter outlines a number of recommendations that flow from each of the 4 sessions that we had, which are about making the economic case, which are about city art strategies, which are about the grand partnership between the education sector and the cultural sector, and which are about making the wider case for the wider impact of the arts. As you can imagine, I've got 10 minutes, which means I can't really do justice to that full range of recommendations, but I'm going to give you a flavour of each of them. Under making the economic case, in addition to talking about things around let's have a good GVA model that Arts Council might lead on that's light touch and meets Treasury requirements, and also let's review the composition of the Creative Industries Council because it's not working. You know that when the DCMS Select Committee has a recommendation mandating ministerial attendance that it's already become an irrelevance. But the recommendation I'll highlight is investing in our creative assets inquiry. This built on Martin Smith's brilliant paper. Business should lead on the commissioning of an asset-based study of the cultural industries, trying to bring city investors and the arts and cultural sectors more closely together. A mixed panel of city expertise, proven cultural entrepreneurs, key anchor institutions like the BBC and Channel 4, and other relevant experts would use an investment lens to analyse and amplify the commercial potential and capacity of the sector, and the terms of reference would be co-produced with Arts Council, BFI, BIS and DCMS. I'm sure we'll discuss. Martin's here to defend his idea. In terms of the grand partnership between schools and education, again, we made a whole range of recommendations about curricula, on monitoring the level of cultural education provision in our schools over the next 3 years, and there's a role there for the Cultural Education Partnership Group, which you will be well aware of. The thing that I'd like to highlight, because I think it's more in tune with the bigger sweep of our discussions this morning, is that I'd highlight our recommendation that consortia of cultural organisations should come together and make more ambitious interventions in education provision. So, for example, if the cultural sector truly values the role of the arts in education, how could it better support the best directors of children and youth services across the country? Or how could it more actively shape the practice of teaching schools to ensure high cultural education practice? With regard to arts and regeneration and city strategies, the key message from Alexandra Jones is that we actually need an end to cut and paste unsophisticated boosterism policies which put arts and culture at their heart but really don't deliver. And what we suggest, there's a number of recommendations there about how we move from that, but the centrepiece recommendation I'd like to highlight is we've called for the creation of a Creating Resilient Places Commission. And so building on the lessons of Arts Council, England's current Creative People and Place initiative, Arts Council, DCMS, DCLG should commission a Creating Resilient Places study with strong representation from the culture sector and other key government departments, Department of Health, Health and Wellbeing Boards, Department of Education, which examines the key interventions required to build greater resilience in cities and places. You might think that sounds a bit grand. It's not. Similar ambition is being shown overseas. The Rockefeller Foundation recently announced its 100 Resilient Cities Centennial Challenge, which are initiatives seeking to foster a global conversation about urban resilience and what can we do to make our cities places of growth and opportunity now and in the future. All too often, the arts and cultural sector doesn't operate with this scale of ambition, and perhaps as a consequence, we're rarely sought out as a fully fledged strategic partner by government and other agencies as they consider these vital future challenges. Finally, with regard to the fourth seminar on capturing the wider impact of the arts, we call upon Arts Council to commission, working in partnership with DCMS, DFE and the HRC and other key trusts and foundations, some of whom are here this morning, at least one high burden of proof study. So for those of you that didn't come to that seminar, we had a big debate about burden of proof. You know, what level of quality of analysis in terms of proving causality, not just some correlations, which can involve, for those of you that love this stuff, randomized controlled trials. In other words, tough tests of causality, which some of that paper Daniel and Mandy and Daniel brilliantly direct us to. So what would one of those high burden approved studies look like, which would explore the impact of particular arts interventions in a key impact area? It could be health and well-being, could be education, could be community cohesion, and this approach should be repeated at the start of every 3-year funding cycle. The key point there is an interesting issue around, actually, there's lots of arts and evaluation going across the cultural sector, but actually we know when we talk to government officials, they say that not enough of it is of a quality that's convincing them. So actually maybe we should be pooling resources to do a limited number of very high burden of proof studies and freeing up the sector to actually do more evaluation that's geared towards improvement and development rather than always proving their case and the validity of what they do, but rather developing and experimenting what they do. So those recommendations I think are valuable in their own right. They're rallying calls for action and advocacy. But perhaps I think the greater value of the seminars is that they're brought into sharp relief some necessary challenges and priorities for those who support the arts, and obviously therefore the people in this room. I'm going to give you a quote from Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travelled. "Vision is the art of seeing what is invisible to others." And for me, our discussions have made some important things more visible to us than they were before, and they offer a sort of vision for action and advocacy in the coming years. So what are some of the things that we've made more visible? I think the need for the arts and cultural sector to intervene with more ambition and clarity. There's a big standing challenge in all these papers that we need to focus on impact first and resources second. I've mentioned cultural education already. We need to ask how can we have the biggest impact on the education of our young people and then act accordingly. This may require the arts to make more systemic interventions on teacher training, for example, or things that you can all dream up and think about to maximise impact. And in turn, this may mean turning away from other cultural education activities that are less impactful. These are the tough conversations that I think we need to have. If we were being critical of ourselves, I think we'd say we're often too path dependent in the things we do and too reactive to trends happening around us. I've heard a lot about what we as a sector think about the government's education policies, but what's our implementable vision of what cultural education needs to look like, and how do we carve out a space to experiment at scale to challenge orthodoxies as fully fledged partners with the education sector? We can't sit outside of the system, we have to be part of it. What else is more visible? The urgent need to identify allies who we can forge deeper partnership with, from higher education to commissioners across the public service. This is happening. For example, I'm sure you have very exciting, those of you that attend What Next meetings in your locality, I'm sure you have equally exciting meetings. Our Cambridge summer meetings were focusing on how we influence our local LEP. But if I was being challenging back to us, I'd say, why aren't there regular sector roundtables led with people with deeper expertise, highlighting that imperative and opportunity and the necessary response from our sectors? My experience is that in our biggest cities, with established and well-resourced cultural leadership, this stuff gets done. But countrywide, the picture is very patchy. This is about sharing opportunity and expertise and creating a sense of urgency. What else has become more visible? The need for a grander narrative and smarter cases across the whole holistic value chain, the subject of Alan and Peter's opening comments. I think the beginnings of that narrative are here in the forwards by the RSA and Arts Council, the ambition displayed in these papers and in our discussions during the seminars. Instead of arts for art's sake or box-ticking instrumentalism, the emphasis of our discussions has been on mainstreaming arts and culture into the broader national and local case for economic and social renewal. Is this what Arts Council means by a holistic approach? I think it may be, with a strong focus on increasing levels of collaboration and innovation. But big challenges remain. Let's give you a few. Which agencies, in a climate of austerity, are going to take on the budgetary responsibility of investing in high-quality, longitudinal, high-burden of proof studies exploring the wider impact of arts and culture? The harsh reality is that the arts and culture sector is relatively starved of analytical and evaluation support as compared to other parts of the third sector. We can discuss it. I think few arts and cultural organisations would support further funding for evaluation if it reduced their direct funding. But if we could tell a richer story about individual cultural experiences and the quality of all the work we do, would that be a short-term cost worth paying to grow the investment pot? We may have to speculate to accumulate, colleagues. We also need to be more demanding partners of government. Neither DCMS or BIS are serving us well in terms of the analytical and strategic support and development of the cultural sector. I think this is me now, rather than being a rapporteur, just to be clear. Just to make none of my fellow paper authors feel that I'm kind of standing on their shoulders, I would say in the absence of a discernible cultural policy pulse in Whitehall, our collective heart is going to have to beat a little faster. For example, we could review the total spend on impact evaluation across the arts and cultural sector and see whether we could pool that money on larger scale evaluations more effectively. What might a People's Manifesto for the Arts look like, written by audience members and communities across the UK, informed by new data on the quality of cultural experiences and aspirations? How can we use the conversations we've started here, and which will continue in different ways over the next 12 months, to galvanise action and energy? I think some questions for all of us this morning that we might want to discuss, if we're going to pursue that agenda, is what do you see are the biggest challenges under this holistic framework that you've heard Peter and Alan talk about? What would be your policy, advocacy and innovation priorities for the arts and cultural sector over the next 12 to 18 months? What are the bigger plays we should be making and with what aims? Which of the recommendations would you rally around and which do you want to avoid? Should Arts Council and others be using their strategic funds differently in pursuit of some of the aims we've just talked about? A lot to discuss. We have the beginnings of a plan, but also we could discuss what does the development coalition to make it happen need to look like. And let's not doubt the urgency. Back to the pragmatic starting point of these seminars, we're already on a countdown to the election, with manifestos being developed and taking firm shape by late 2014, early 2015. So I gave us 12 months, not 18. That just gives us just 12 months for the arts and cultural sector to get the story and its investment pitch to government and its other key partners right. So to close, I want to mention Grayson Perry. Grayson's not new to debates about value and advocacy in the arts. He's been saying interesting things on this long before his recent Reith lectures. He wrote a piece in The Guardian in 2010 where he was writing about the launch of the Cultural Capital campaign. Some of you will remember that very well, I'm sure. A sector response to the forthcoming cuts, stressing the economic value of the arts. You see, we may have been here before, and we need to make sure we do rather better than we've done since then. He described the great and the good of the arts world on the panel that day, Nick Sirota, Jude Kelly, Nick Heitner and others, as glamorous lost leaders of UK Culture PLC, with everyone conscious that the arts weren't really winning the argument. So to close, I think UK Culture PLC needs to give a better account of itself in the next 18 months than we've given in the last 3 years since the Cultural Capital campaign. The good news is no collective PLC in the UK has a richer and more varied value story, a genuine triple bottom line of cultural, economic and social value. But providing that better account will require a willingness to change and collective self-belief that the case for arts and culture can move from the margins to the centre of national and local debate. It requires seriousness, rigour and ambition. Let's see what we can agree on in terms of making that happen and how. Thank you very much, everyone.
thank you very much, Peter, Alan and John. I'm now going to invite the remaining three panellists to respond. And I'm going to ask Nicola Thorold at the end of the table to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikki. And John, thank you as well. I think you and your colleagues have achieved a remarkable synthesis of what have been four very meaty, chunky series of talks. I thought I would just focus on three things just to sort of throw into the mix. And one, the main one I wanted to do was highlight the potential partnership that we could have, or that we do have, with audiences, visitors and participants. I mean, if we're using the language of investment, as I think we all know, 50% of the income that come to arts organisation, cultural organisations in the national portfolio comes from the public, from ticket buyers, etc. And I think that we dwell quite often on how much money we rely on from the box office, if you run a venue like mine. But I think we probably spend less time thinking about the amount of the huge quantity of time that people invest in the arts, and critically, the investment of their imagination, which makes them potentially our strongest partners, because they are, we hope, very much in tune with what we're about and why we're about. In fact, they're our raison d'etre. In 2011, some of us at the Young Vic had a kind of pulled together a conference, which I think quite a few of you may have been at or been aware of, and it was a one-off event, and it was called What Next? And we invited various cultural leaders to come and speak, and to bring with them members of their audiences or visitors or participants to speak as well. And for those of you that were there, you may remember that it was those audiences and participants that completely stole the show. They upstaged everyone else. They were brilliant. And what was brilliant about them was not just the passion they brought in describing how their lives were being transformed, but it was the articulate way in which they talked about the value that that experience had to them. And it became clear that these were the strongest advocates any of us in the room had actually ever heard for the arts and culture. And it was humbling, but very exciting. So when, a year or so later, a similar group was fretting about these issues, about how arts and culture are talked about and perceived in society, the voices of those Sadler's Wells elders and young people from SC1 United and Clean Break were absolutely ringing in our ears. And I think they really influenced and gave us confidence in suggesting an experiment called What Next, which I know some of you are already taking part in. And What Next is not a membership organisation, it's not even an organisation, it's not a campaign, it's not even a cult, which is what my husband calls it when I get up at unbelievably early hours on Wednesday mornings. It's, I think the best way to describe it is it's a movement, and its aim is to raise awareness of the value of arts and culture, particularly with the public, and to actually engage public debate around this and find a way of articulating, not just amongst ourselves and not just amongst politicians and people working in the political arena, but actually the wider tax-paying, voting public who we make the work for and with. And that brings me on to the second point I wanted to make, which is a provocation that, in fact, I think you'll hear, that a chair of one of the What Next groups made a couple of weeks ago. And she stood up and said, I want to be provocative. She doesn't work in the arts. She's an audience member. And she said, you keep talking about, or we keep talking about, what we want to say to the public, or what the messages we want to send to the public, but we're not talking about the conversation we should have with the public. And I think that's challenging. And it's particularly challenging when she pointed out that many of the conversations that had been initiated in her experience by arts organisations with the public had actually led to asking for money or asking for some lobbying support. It was not dialogue. It was not about bigger picture. It was not finding a common ground that, that was of mutual interest. And the themes that John's picked out from the series of debates and reports, I think all of them, if we were to adopt them, all of them ask us to change our way of thinking and our behaviour. It is about a culture change, and I think Baz has referred, and Alan have referred to that as well, if we're actually to kind of really grasp some of these nettles. And that is, we all know that, that's hard. It's like any partnership building, it's hard. It takes thinking about where we prioritise resources. It takes thinking about how we prioritise our time, and I think that is possibly the biggest challenge. And it's also about how we use our imagination, going back to those three things. But the key thing is that if we are going to shift in any way, and if we are going to kind of embrace some of these recommendations, it will take time to do. And I'm not sure how much time, you know, we talked about 12 months, we talked about 18 months, but, you know, we're talking years to really shift. So I think that needs to be kind of aired and reflected on. And then finally, I just wanted to mention very briefly, because I think others will want to talk more about this, about arts and education and the role of creativity in education, which for me goes to absolutely heart of this debate and the conversation we might be having with the public and generally. Because if we don't really believe that our children and our futures should have creativity absolutely running through it like a stick of rock, we are going to change the culture of this country. And for me, that it would be the poorer. And that that then goes me to think that actually what we're perhaps getting better at doing and more confident, and I hope that will increase, is have the confidence to be able to articulate the kind of world we want to live in, and the kind of and where creativity sits in that. And I think that then goes right back to where I started with those audience members and participants who were so kind of brilliant and inspiring. Actually, we've got a lot to learn from the people that come and visit us and pay money to see us and support us and make work with us, because quite a lot of them are really good at talking about it already.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you very much. Simon.
Yes, good morning. I guess I'm here to give you a regional city perspective. And I have to say, in Bristol, we completely get that culture is central to our economic life. You know, it's crucial to our economic development. It's absolutely at the heart of attracting business relocation, attracting the skilled people we need to work in our hospitals, our universities. It's at the centre of our city brand. And I think that's been manifested in the partnerships that we've built up over the last few years. We were the first city to sign an anchor agreement with the BBC, which means them really articulating what their commitment and their investment is going forward, working with us on key digital projects with our universities. A vital, fantastic partnership. Like many cities, we have a really good relationship with the Homes and Communities Agency, which has allowed us to turn a vast old bottling plant in South Bristol into a film studio. Completely bonkers project in this climate, and we did it 3 years ago, and God knows how we'll keep it going, but immensely exciting. And probably most importantly, we are the only city to have a memorandum of understanding with the Arts Council. And just briefly how that came about was that when all this recession started 5 years ago, and we had the first, cutting budget, the administration had decided it was going to put protect cultural spending. But nevertheless, I had a rather sharp-suited officer come into my office, sit down, put the list of funded organisations in front of me and said, we need to cut 20% off this. And I said, no, you don't. He now works in Nottingham. But I went to the leader and I said, look, this does not make sense. If we really believe that culture is vital to our city, we are not going to cut funding to the Bristol Old Vic, to Spike Island, to Arnolfini, to Watershed. That is counterproductive. So we went to the Arts Council and we said, look, you have relationship managers, And they go along to shows and they go along to exhibitions with our arts officers, and they do the monitoring and the evaluation. And we've got 2 lots of public servants sitting there doing the same thing. That is not a good use of public money. So we took the somewhat draconian step of cutting more or less all of our arts officers. And I saved £440,000 off the budget, which kept that officer happy. But we protected the level of our investment in arts organisations. And that's enabled us as well, the MOU has enabled us to work with the Arts Council on the last NPO round. So we synchronised our round of finance for local arts organisations with the Arts Council. We discussed it with them, and we came up with agreements, both of us, and we actually awarded the same inflation rise over the 3 years that the Arts Council did with the MPO round. And we'll be doing that again in January. And we, again, the Mayor has said, we want to protect arts investment because it is absolutely vital to the city. And we made it very painless for the arts organisations. They'll be applying for NPO status, and they'll simply cut and paste that onto our application form, and we'll evaluate it, and then we'll get together with the Arts Council. They'll fund some people, we don't. We'll fund some people, they don't, but the majority of organisations will be funded by both. And that works extremely well. But, you know, funding really is at the heart of what we're talking about this morning. I was talking to Baz earlier about the cultural imbalance report that came out last Thursday. Very interesting report. As he said, not entirely fair, but it's actually struck a nerve. That doesn't mean, certainly we as a city, and I don't think the regions generally, think that London should suddenly be starved of funding. You know, London is the jewel in the UK's crown, whether you like it or not. It's almost a separate economy. And our arts institutions are absolutely fabulous. I love going to the National Theatre and the Royal Opera House, and they should be funded, you know, to do what they do. But you've got to fund the regions as well. And the problem is that historically, if you go back 10 years, and you took the totality of what local government funds and the totality of what the Arts Council fund, the local government figure would be much bigger. But that's the figure that's shrinking. And my God, is it shrinking fast. And when I look at, we've got the figures from the Treasury about our support grant for the next 3 years, but when I look at what our officers are predicting it might go down to, it is truly frightening. And, you know, so we have to think of ways, be innovative, and I think that came out in John Knell's report, of different ways of funding, different ways of approaching different streams of funding. Because if we don't, the regions will die. I don't know how long I can, as long as I'm in this job, go on protecting the Arts Council in Bristol. You know, we're absolutely adamant we want to, and the Mayor is adamant, but, you know, you can't spend money you haven't got. So we have to be innovative, we have to be brave. And I'll just come back to that mad project we got in South Bristol, the film studios. I went out there the other day to talk about how we invest in the future with some rather solid officers from the strategic leadership team, and one of them sort of threw down his pencil and says, well, it doesn't stack up, does it? It doesn't stack up, and there's not even economic impact on South Bristol isn't very high, so shrugged his shoulders. And I said, actually, if you put some capital in now, it will stack up in the future. We know, we've done the figures. It's not about now. I know now is difficult, but it's about the future.
Thank you. Many points to pick up on there, and we had the benefit of seeing this paper a little bit in advance, so although I've not read it in great detail, I have read some of it. And 2 or 3 things I'd like to pick up on, and if we're lucky, I might even be able to weave a narrative link through them, but I might not. The first was really around a strong sense of us needing either to connect the various arguments we're making, or at least to stop arguing about the arguments we're making, because we've got people saying artists make work because they want to, we've got people saying that art's for art's sake, we've got the intrinsic versus the extrinsic, economic or cultural or social value. And actually, I think those arguments can be connected into a holistic case, which is, I know, what Peter and Alan are trying to do. You'll see in the foreword that Peter and Alan write, they write beautifully about the power of art to impact on us as individuals. They talk about how the arts illuminate our inner lives, how they enrich our own emotional world. What they don't specifically highlight, but I'm sure they would agree, is that in enriching our own worlds and increasing our own concepts and our own ability to experience emotions that we may not have ourselves, but we can understand through artistic experience, we actually increase our understanding of other people and their worlds. And in doing so, we breed something which I think could not be more important at any time than now, which is tolerance. So I think that it's the contribution to the individual which is the basis of the value of the contribution to the collective or indeed to society. Because if you take the compassion that arts can engender, the tolerance they can engender, and you match that with the mirror neurons that the scientists discovered in our brain in the early 90s, which allow us to socialize, then you have the basis of a society in which we can live together with diverse opinions and views and differing faiths and beliefs, but we can live together collectively and subjugate some of our own individual ambitions or hopes or beliefs to the greater good of the whole. Now, that comes under the category of my passionate beliefs. Whether that's actually true, of course, I'm going to come to that a little bit later on. But it does lead me, it leads me on to my second point, which is that if you believe something else Peter and Alan write, that our arts sector is a major contributor to social well-being, in that it engages with the old, the sick, and regeneration and so on, then if you believe that's true, then I think you can argue, and I'm not going to look at Patricia as I say this, because we've had this discussion, and the economists will struggle, I'm sure, with this, but I think if you are going to argue there's a social benefit to culture, then you have to be able to argue that there is an economic cost of taking it away. Because if culture is going to reduce offending rates, if it's going to reduce truantism, if it's going to improve mental and physical health, then if you take culture away, you are going to have a cost in increased prison places, increased hospital beds, increased psychiatric wards, increased social care interventions, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm sure that's not an easy argument to make, but I think it's an argument that we're not yet thinking about. We're saying, is this social value or is it economic value? Actually, it's two sides of the same coin, because you take it away and there will be a cost down the line into the future. And that sort of leads me on to my next point, which is that when I made quite a big move from very much the performing arts sector into the university environment about 12 or 18 months ago, one of the things that drove me to make that move was a continued frustration at the lack of evidence about the value of culture. That we all have, everybody in this room has powerful stories about the impact of culture on individuals. We've all seen it. We've been in those classrooms. We've been in those situations where culture has really impacted on individuals. But as I never tire of saying, because I think it's a great line and it's not mine, the plural of anecdote is not evidence. And John mentions the crowded landscape now around cultural value. I don't think it can be too crowded, but there is a lot of work going on. There's the AHRC project, there's the commission that Vikki's going to be chairing, the Warwick Commission. And John says that this suggests a continuing weakness in the evidence base around culture and the arts. So in my first year at King's, three things became glaringly obvious. One is that there is an increased appetite in the sector, without doubt, for access to the evidence that will support evidence-based decision-making, but also making a case to government. And those two are not necessarily the same thing, because the evidence might say that things are not working. We have to be ready for that if we're going to ask for evidence. Second, there is in fact a growing evidence base. It's not complete by any means, but there is evidence. The Arts and Humanities Research Council funds £60 million of research every year. Now, that's not necessarily all about the sort of stuff we would want. That's a lot of money. There are, I think, 12,000 pieces of research in the case database at DCMS. Some of it's sport, but some of it's culture. So the third thing I discovered in my, or understood perhaps in my first year at King's, was that this evidence base is very, very rarely accessed by sector professionals like me, because there is a huge gap between the language and the approaches that are used in the academic environment and the, in sharing the results of completed research and the needs and the language that the sector uses. By and large, research is written so that it's referable, not so that it's referred to, and that's a big, big difference. So if I want evidence, I have to Google. Does anybody know about? And that's a ridiculous way to going about finding the evidence we need. So what we're doing at King's is developing an online resource for the cultural sector, which does something really completely simple, but it bridges the gap between academic research and its potential beneficiaries by effectively translating academic standard research, a level of lay translation, a lay abstract, which highlights the key recommendations and findings so that people in the cultural sector can have access to that and use it in decision making. And when we launch the prototype in the spring, it won't be directed at other academic researchers, it'll be directed at the cultural sector. And it may, Mandy Barnett talks about the lack of a platform where best practice is shared, and I hope that this will be one step towards creating a platform where that can be shared. So that really, the last thing I wanted to say, I thought what was missing in the paper, and indeed is missing in the blobs, is a complete understanding or a complete recognition of what the higher education sector does, because of course the higher education sector doesn't just do education, it is the home of academic standard research. And in your blobs that's not there, so you need another blob, or you need to enrich your blobs. Martin's essay does mention the partnership between HE and the private sector. He highlights Watershed, in fact, but that's really the only place that I found in my first skim, and forgive me if I'm wrong, where really that was unpicked. So by and large that potential is not explored. There is talk of developing a shared research agenda, and I would add a few recommendations to the paper. If we are going to develop a shared research agenda, it's not just with the AHRC, it's with the ESRC, Economic Social Research Council, and perhaps others. I think some of the issues we'll need to address is that connections between higher education, the academic research environment, and cultural organisations are often ad hominem. They are about individuals contributing research to programme notes or productions. And they're not organisational, so they can't necessarily be strategic. There is currently very little formal linkage between the research councils and the arts council, and I think that's something we can build on. I think we need to map the partnerships, we need to map best practice, we need to look at issues like language, timescales, levels and duration of focus. Researchers, this is a terrible, I probably shouldn't say it, but I think sometimes academic research, the head's down a bit too long, and sometimes artists, the head's up a little too soon, and if we find somewhere between the two, that's a terrible caricature. I know they'll be writing in. But I think finally I would say that this can be a genuine and symbiotic partnership. It's not a begging bowl relationship. Arts and culture arts and culture need academia because they need the research, they need academic standard research, longitudinal research, high burden of proof research. But on the other hand, higher education and the academic research needs arts and culture. It can enhance the student experience, Peter mentioned that. It can provide mechanisms for academics to demonstrate impact, which they absolutely need to do. It provides mechanisms for interdisciplinarity because arts and culture are interdisciplinary by their very nature. It can help with the widening participation agenda. You, the arts and cultural sector, are 20 years in front of higher education in recognising the need for access, engagement, public engagement. But crucially, I would say arts and culture have the potential to drive innovation and new thinking within the research environment. And I'm going to quote an economist now, because Keynes said this brilliant thing about Newton. In a lecture about Newton, he said, proof is not the instrument of discovery. Now, he didn't add, but I would, that risk-taking, creativity, imagination, and intuition are the instrument of discovery, and proof's what comes out the end of it. So there is a potential for a genuine grand partnership between higher education in its fullest sense, and that I would like to kind of add into the mix. So
thank you very much, Deborah. So this is going to be interesting. a very short amount of time to open this up to the floor. I'd like to cluster a few questions around some of the areas we've been looking at, so that we don't splattergun this, otherwise we may not be able to make best use of time. So if there are particular questions around the economic impact issue, I would be very pleased to take those first, and then I will move on to education, research, higher education. Yes, back there. There are microphones. I'll take 3 questions.
Michael Roberts, a fellow of the RSA. Pache Arts Council England. I'm rather surprised not to have heard the word Europe mentioned. There seem to me 2 basic points that hinge on the economic impact of the arts as regards Europe. First of all, the European Union has just approved a new Creative Europe programme worth 1.8 billion euro over the next 7 years. Now, the Treasury are contributing roughly 10% of that budget, and the UK ought to expect to get back at least 10%, probably rather more. So how does that fit with what you're saying? And since we've just had this Creative Europe programme gone through the Council, 28 member state governments, the European Parliament, with a careful reconsideration of objectives, of how projects should be evaluated, and you focus on partnerships, and you focus on digital. I mean, to some extent, aren't we here trying to reinvent the wheel? Okay. Has Europe done it for us?
Thank you. Peter, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I think you make a really good point. Actually, at all levels of activity, Europe is entering... it has entered the discussion, but you may be right, not strongly enough, because also in all the work the LEPs are doing, where they have to create jobs, but they have to attract match funding, investment in arts and culture will, in the end, end up as match funding for European money that LEPs attract. So I think there's more than one example of it. But when you say, are we reinventing the wheel, I wonder how many people in this room have read what you appear to be admirably familiar with. Hands up, who's read it?
Actually, it's quite good.
7 people have read it. So, and I haven't, by the way, I'll come clean. But Alan, the chief executive, did put his hand up, so he has. And it underlines, doesn't it? It underlines, though, doesn't it, how we're not joined up on it. So I absolutely take the point. Alan, do you want to add to that?
Well, no, I take your point entirely, and we're plotting with the British Council and PFI to make sure that the arts organisations in this country get more out of the next culture fund, because we know we didn't get enough out of the last one. And I mean, it's all been a bit tricky because the Brits weren't the best participants in the negotiations, I think it's probably safe to say, in Europe itself. But now we've got to get as much out of what's there as we can.
But I guess I'd just make one more very small point, which is in terms of your point about reinventing the wheel. How many people outside this room understand the wheel? How many people know about the wheel? How many people buy it? And so whether the thinking comes from Europe or comes from within the UK, what we're talking about here today is gathering a consensus around a set of principles which probably have not been put together adequately before, I would argue.
Okay, I'd like to take a question now on education. There are various different points made around education, including no questions around education. Okay, urban regeneration, city development, the points put forward by Simon, the ideas that are in the report that John referred to, place-based commissioning. No, everyone was perfectly happy about all of those ideas. Yes! Microphone's just coming.
Thanks very much. Christine Spear, Fellow. Just on regeneration, the economy, I think, is actually one of the most important ones, and you touched on it quite a bit. I think that more should be looked into as look more into the results of money given, what projects work and don't work. Because one of the things that I've noticed is that some projects that receive Arts Council money and lottery funding are not done in integration with the rest of the community, and they fail. And taxpayers who are against putting money into the arts pick up on that very, very quickly. There's been some major failures, but there's also been some small, and even small white elephants in smaller communities are a huge waste of money and stick out as a very obvious, so more integration with the rest of the community. I think sometimes that's not looked into. And also I think money is often given to groups who do not have the experience to deal with the finances of what they're doing. So there should be far more oversight towards projects, the people running projects, to ensure that they actually use them. In a place like Bristol, you'd have plenty of people to deal with that, but in smaller communities, there aren't. So money gets quite wasted.
I think there's an interesting issue here to do with how we might change the way in which work is commissioned, because there is the challenge there is around about how artists create their work. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to address going forward is how we can bring the world of the creative artist more strongly into these debates about whether it's place-based commissioning or whether it's how creativity is taught in schools. Because, in a sense, what we're asking for in terms of behavioural change is as big a shift as happened 20 years ago when people started to really integrate educational activity in the work of their arts organisations. And when I first started my career, that was very peripheral and to one side, and now it's right in the heart. But we are really getting to the heart of what motivates an artist to create art in a way that can be demonstrated and connected like that. And that is, I think, to really get into the meat of that, we are going to have to bring many more audience members and many more artists to the table to have a really honest debate about how you can expose that creativity to that level of delivery without affecting the very art that we want to have the freedom to be creative. And I think that in all of this behavioural change, the role of the artist in society is something that we are really going to have to dig into a lot further in order to make sure that we can both protect that art, but also make sure that it is demonstrating all of the impact that it has. Sorry, John.
I might cue Mandy in, who's here, who wrote the fourth paper, but I didn't like the word, it's just the word oversight, because I think it's more about the fact that quite often some of these interventions don't have a clear logic model for all of the things they're trying to impact on and what the value is. And then the commissioners aren't building an adequate evaluation budget up front to capture those, and also capturing the possibility for risk and failure, rather than, I mean, if you see what I mean. So in other words, it's an interesting notion about money being wasted. I mean, so I get the point about capacity, but on an evaluation point, it's partly more about we need to get better at working out right from the outset, if we've got public money going into a project which has multiple objectives, for example, other than just cultural, what have we been really clear about the distinct investment logics, the outcomes that we're saying? I mean, Mandy, I don't know whether you wanted to say something on that. Mandy Barnett, one of the paper authors.
That I wanted to make, which is really to make the case for valuation. And I know lots of people are resistant to this, but the idea that we don't value everything that we do on the whole value chain, from investment through the good practice of delivery to outcomes, is nonsense. It is done, but it's done by the people who hold the purse strings. Yep. So the case that I want to make links the process of valuation to empowerment. And it says that actually if we start to value things much more clearly all along that value chain, then that value becomes owned by all the participants, including the audience that you mentioned, who are part of that process. And the panel members have all mentioned the notion of valuation. They talked about the investment of imagination, the value to the economy, what a cut in investment, what the cost of taking culture away means. We're talking about it all the time, but we fight shy of actually quantifying it. And until we do that through that whole logic model, we won't empower people who are participants or audiences in the cultural sector to to own it as well as us.
So what I'm going to do now is everyone is trying to catch my eye, so I'm actually going to ask for a sum-up moment from each one of the panellists here, ending with John, and it's going to skip Peter, ending with John. I want Matthew Taylor to say a few words, and then for Peter to do a final summing up. Thank you very much. It's the end.
Oh, can we go?
It is the end. It's downstairs for more chat.
Okay, right, fine.
Well, I don't know if this is a summing up, but I was struck as you were speaking about failure, that one of the things that perhaps we're quite poor at talking about is the fact that an awful lot of public subsidy in the arts, as it is in science, is in R&D. And actually failure is part of that process and integral to that process. And without failure, we'll stultify. And I think that and I don't know what examples you're particularly having in mind, but quite often things that are seen to have failed or have been a waste of money have actually been an amazing educational learning experience for the artists and the others involved in it, which will mean that next time they will do something with real power and impact. In the science world, you expect failure, you don't expect success. That's what you're doing. You're always testing, and failure, you're learning from failure in order to find success. And I think scientists have been very good at explaining that and getting that across to the public and the taxpayer. I suspect we haven't been quite so good at it.
Thank you. Simon.
I mean, I think education is, and putting culture at the heart of education is absolutely crucial. I do think we should be careful of not over-jargonizing ourselves in, wonderful plans and strategies that remain just that. A lot of these things are quite simple and they're quite cheap. I used to be on the board of a charity that used to put artists into schools and working alongside the curriculum just to do a dance class in working class areas, of Bristol. And we used to take bunches of kids from kind of hard council estates to ballet in the centre of Bristol. Some of these kids had never been to the centre of Bristol, and yet it was quite transformative. And I often tell this story, but I remember one girl at the Knell West Media Centre. She made a film on her local council estate, and we went to a showing of it, and I had a long day and thought, oh Christ, I don't want to do this particularly, but I turned up, and this girl got up and she showed the film, and she said, and there were about 50 people there, and she said, if I'd not been involved in this film, I would never have had the courage to get up and speak to such a lot of people here today. That, that's a simple thing. It doesn't cost much, and we need to do more of that.
Deborah. I think I'd like to kind of look forward and say I think my sense over the last one of the brilliant things about being properly funded over recent years, not so recent, a little less than recent years, that growth in funding in the arts developed a very grown-up sector which works in a very, very collegiate way. So I think that one of the benefits is that we have the potential, and you see it with the What Next chapters, but we have the potential now to have a joined-up conversation about bigger needs, not about our own individual needs as organisations. So I think my challenge to us all would be, what do we do with this? What do we do with the work that's going to come out of the Warwick Commission? What do we do with the work that's coming out of all sorts of interesting bodies that are thinking and working? How do we ensure that hooks up together, and we don't, in this more austere and difficult climate, we don't lose that ability to hold on together to the sort of greater good. I think, Peter and Alan talked earlier about, we making the arguments and telling the stories. We've been telling the stories for quite a long time, and it hasn't hit home. So we need to learn from the failure, or to learn what hasn't worked, and say, how do we make the case that will hit home? How do we hold on to the ability to do that together as a sector and not fall back into taking individual positions because times are tough?
Thank you very much. John?
If to use the analogy I used earlier, if we think of UK Culture PAC as this incredibly diverse conglomerate of difference, diversity, voice, expertise, I don't think we've begun the task of thinking about how to coordinate those assets properly to have a bigger impact across this value range. My experience of all of this has been that I think the arts sector's got very good at rationales for funding. Artists and arts organisations are brilliantly entrepreneurial. They're very good at making pitches for why they should have money. But actually, in terms of where are we on a strategy for coordinating those assets, exploiting them properly, building in what it means to have a bigger impact, and then shaping risk, collaboration, innovation at the heart of that, and evaluation strategies that capture that full impact, I'm afraid we feel a bit in the foothills. So I think that's the challenge that I take from today and to put forward. And we need to find a way of keeping the conversation going with all of you. So thank you.
Matthew.
Thanks, Vikki. So tomorrow I'm doing a speech to a group of 50 people who are heads of transformation in local government. It's kind of slightly mind-boggling, the idea that some middle-ranking local government officer gets told you're now head of transformation. And one of the things I'll be saying to them is that as local authorities, as other local agencies, deal with the twin problems of producing models of sustainable long-term economic growth and dealing with austerity, they do have to transform. And the heart of that transformation process involves, I think, three processes in particular. Firstly, a step change in the quality of collaboration between local agencies. Secondly, a step change in the quality of public engagement, so the public are part of finding solutions. And thirdly, a step change in innovation, which goes to Nicola's point, actually, about failure. And the thing that comes out of that is collaboration, engagement, risk-taking, innovation. These are things which arts and cultural organisations know a great deal about. And so the point I want to make, which is in a way a pitch for future work the RSA would like to do in this space, is to move from blobs to a kind of dartboard, which is that, what we talk about is when people don't get arts and culture at all, the dart doesn't even reach the board. And then we talk about darts reaching the board. And if people think about art just for itself, well, that's hitting the board. If they think about art and the possible economic effects, that's a double. And if they think about art and economic and social effects, that's a holistic treble, brilliant. But I think we need to think about the bullseye. And the RSA did a project supported by the Arts Council in Peterborough over the last few years. You can read the report on our website. It's very honest in the warts and all assessment. But the most valuable part of that research turned out to be something which we weren't planning at all, and that was the use of creative practice in changing the way that agencies in Peterborough work together. And so for me, the bullseye in all of this is how do we get arts and cultural practice to the very heart of conversations about the transformations that places have to go through over the next 10 years if they're to develop sustainable models of economy and to deal with public sector austerity. So moving from the margins to the idea that arts and creativity is at the heart of finding solutions about how places prosper. So that's what we'd like to do more work on.
Thank you. Peter.
Matthew, thanks so much for that. And thank you to everybody today for contributing to the debate and inputting into what was essentially our provocation. I guess there were some words missing at the bottom of our now famously described as blob collection of blobs, and that was the words, the case for public support of arts and culture. And public support is a wide phrase because that includes education, business, individuals, trusts and foundations, as well as government and local government. And those were the members of what, at the beginning of this whole process, I described as the Grand Partnership. And I guess the two challenges for us to take forward today are to pick up on what Nicola said, to have that conversation properly with all of the people in those constituencies who are the people who benefit and the people who are part of it. They're the audiences, they're the performers and so on. And it has to be a conversation, not a lecture. And it shouldn't merely be a matter of self-interest. It should always be about the benefit that's conferred. It's about benefit conferred. And the second challenge is that the policy that comes out of this, and I just go back to something I said at the beginning, I do think and John, you've said it very eloquently, we're policy light. How do you make this greater than the sum of its parts? So that's the challenge for the next 18 months. It's great that there are a plethora, actually, of studies and think tanks doing work on this, and Matthew's offer from the RSA is incredibly welcome. It's great that he wants to push that forward in that way. And so just to take Matthew's already extended metaphor of the dartboard to the point of perdition, Matthew, I think in the next 18 months the challenge is we can do better than a bullseye. We need to say, by the time of the next election, 180!
Thank you very much, Peter. One of the things that I found of the rhythm of my life as an arts professional is that one is guided, and rightly guided, and I'm not being naive when I say this, guided by the political rhythm of the next general election. But I also really hope that we could take a longer view on this one, that it is about a lead up to the next 18 months, and I'm not wishing us to be naive about that. But actually, one of the dangers of that is that you don't really go as it were, behind the curtain and sort things out properly. And I would beg that we look at this, that Plan A is longer than 18 months. It is about a different kind of way of articulating the arts. That this will take a while because we are talking about behavioural change, real systemic behavioural change, and actually power and access to money. Let's be honest about it. That's one of the things we're going to have to talk about when we get into all of this, how to make each pound go further. And there have been examples of nasty decisions that have been made in individuals' lives which have unlocked funds for other things to happen. This is going to, if it's going to be meaningful, this is going to create change within a funding process. It's going to create behavioural change in arts organisations. And perhaps, and rather wonderfully, as Nicola put it, we might actually start having a real debate and a conversation with our artists and our audiences, which I'm not sure at the moment we always do. Thank you very much. That we could have sat here all morning and debated this, as you could see, but we can't. I'm sorry if you're watching this from your own screen at home, because you now can't join us all for a cup of coffee downstairs, but you can download the report, both from the RSA website and from the Arts Council's website. Use the opportunity to comment. I'm really pleased that the blog chart's got a feedback button. We will continue this debate and we will make change happen. I think that is a commitment that both the RSA and the Arts Council and many other important organisations around the country are now committed to. Thank you very much. Thank you.